The first complete genome from Old Kingdom Egypt did not come from a king. It did not come from a golden tomb, a royal mummy, or a face the world already knew. It came from a man buried inside a large ceramic vessel, sealed in a rock-cut tomb near the Nile Valley, far from the image most people carry when they imagine ancient Egypt. He had lived more than 4,500 years ago, near the beginning of the Pyramid Age, when the Egyptian state was still young enough to remember its formation and old enough to build monuments that would outlive almost everything around them. His body was not perfect. That is part of what makes him useful. The skeleton carried the ordinary violence of a human life: worn teeth, used joints, bones shaped by repetition and labor. He was not a god king turned into gold. He was a working body preserved by a strange accident of burial, climate, and time. Long after his name disappeared, long after the village around him was gone, long after Egypt itself had passed through kingdoms, invasions, empires, languages, religions, and revolutions, enough of his DNA remained for scientists to read it, and when they did, the answer was not the one modern people wanted. For centuries, ancient Egypt has been treated less like a civilization than a prize. Everyone has wanted to claim it, explain it, purify it, or place it inside a modern category. Was Egypt African? Was it Near Eastern? Was it Mediterranean? Was it black? Was it white? Was it indigenous to the Nile, or sparked by outsiders from somewhere else? The question has been asked so many times that it begins to sound natural, but it is not a question the ancient Egyptians themselves would have recognized. It belongs to us, not to them. The dead were made to testify in a trial they never agreed to enter. Statues became evidence. Skin tones in tomb paintings became evidence. The shape of noses and lips became evidence. Mummies, masks, skulls, hair, and paintings were pulled into a modern identity war, as if a civilization that lasted for thousands of years could be reduced to one face, one color, one origin, or one modern word. Ancient DNA did not end that argument by choosing a side. It did something more unsettling. It showed that the argument itself had been built too small. The ancient Egyptians were never who we thought they were, not because the old stories were entirely false, but because each one tried to make Egypt simpler than it was. The Nile Valley was never a sealed chamber in the desert. It was a corridor, a refuge, a borderland, and a meeting place, all at the same time. To understand the DNA, you have to begin with geography, because Egypt's geography is deceptive. From a distance, the country looks like a miracle of isolation, a strip of green life pressed between deserts, a river cutting through sand, a civilization protected by heat, distance, and stone. The Western Desert, the Eastern Desert, the Red Sea Mountains, the Mediterranean, Sinai, Nubia, and the Sahara all seem to wrap Egypt in natural walls. But walls are not the whole story. The Nile did not only protect Egypt, it moved Egypt. It carried grain, boats, priests, workers, soldiers, officials, cattle, stone, stories, taxes, and bodies. It made a narrow country feel connected from south to north. At the same time, the delta opened toward the Levant, Sinai opened toward Western Asia, the Red Sea looked toward Arabia and beyond. The southern Nile led toward Nubia and deeper northeastern Africa. The oases reached into North Africa and the desert worlds beyond the river. Egypt was protected, but not closed. It was local, but not isolated. That distinction is the key to the entire story. For a long time, people tried to explain ancient Egypt through three competing ideas. The first was the pure Nile story, Egypt as the product of local northeastern African development, shaped by the river, the flood, the desert, and thousands of years of internal continuity. In this version, everything important came from the Nile itself. Agriculture, kingship, religion, writing, architecture, and state power grew out of a local world that had no need for an outside spark. The second was the foreign spark story. In older forms, it imagined that Egypt's sudden rise looked too organized, too monumental, too sophisticated to be explained from within the valley alone. Some theorists looked eastward, toward Mesopotamia or the Levant, and imagined migrants, elites, technologies, or symbols crossing into Egypt and pushing it toward civilization. Archaeology did show contact between Egypt and Western Asia, especially before and during the early dynastic period, but contact is not the same as replacement, and imported ideas are not the same as imported populations. The third story was the modern identity story, and it is the most dangerous because it pretends to be the simplest. It asks whether ancient Egyptians were one modern racial or ethnic category, then hunts through images and bones for proof. This is the story that fills comment sections, documentaries, arguments, and political claims. It is also the story ancient DNA is least able to satisfy, because DNA can describe ancestry, but it cannot turn a person from 4,500 years ago into a modern identity. The first major attempt to make ancient Egyptian DNA speak came in 2017 from the mummies of Abusir el-Meleq in Middle Egypt. That study was important because for years many researchers doubted whether reliable ancient DNA could be recovered from Egyptian mummies at all. Egypt's climate is unforgiving to DNA. Heat breaks it down. Humidity, salts, microbes, and mummification chemistry can damage what remains. Mummies preserve the shape of the body for the human eye, but not always the genome for the laboratory. The Abusir study changed that. Scientists sampled 151 mummified individuals, recovered 90 mitochondrial genomes, and obtained genome-wide data from 3 people. The samples came from a long period, from the late New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic and Roman eras, and they came from one site in Middle Egypt. That last fact matters as much as the result. What the study found was real, but narrow. Across that sampled population, there was considerable maternal continuity over more than 1,000 years. The ancient individuals also appeared, in the available data, to be closer to ancient and modern populations of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean than modern Egyptians were. Modern Egyptians, by comparison, carried more sub-Saharan African-related ancestry, likely reflecting later historical movements, trade, and demographic change. It was tempting to turn that into a headline. Ancient Egyptians were closer to the Near East than modern Egyptians, but the honest version is more careful. The study opened a door, but it did not show the whole house. It was one site, mostly late in Egypt's long history, with only 3 nuclear genomes. It could not represent the Delta, Upper Egypt, the earliest dynasties, all social classes, every region, or 3,000 years of civilization. That is why the Nuwayrat genome mattered so much. The man from Nuwayrat pushed the genetic window far earlier, into the world of the early dynastic and Old Kingdom transition, roughly between 2855 and 2570 BCE. This was the age when Egypt was becoming recognizably pharaonic. Royal power was consolidating. Monumental building was escalating. The state was organizing labor at a scale that still feels almost impossible. If ancient DNA could reach into this period, it would not just sample Egypt after centuries of empire and contact. It would touch Egypt near the time its classic form was being made. The man himself makes the story feel less abstract. He was found in a cliff tomb, placed inside a ceramic vessel, rather than preserved through the later image of elaborate royal mummification. His skeleton suggested a life of use, not ease. Some interpretations of his boneware point toward repeated labor, perhaps craftwork, possibly even pottery-related activity, though this should not be overstated. What matters for the story is that his body brings the question down from kings and statues to one individual life. Ancient Egypt was not only pharaohs, it was also hands, backs, teeth, tools, and labor. When scientists read his genome, they found a layered answer. Most of his ancestry was best modeled with a North African Neolithic-related source. In the statistical language of the paper, this source is represented by ancient genomes from Northwest Africa, because those are the available ancient reference populations that best fit the model. That does not mean the man came from Morocco, or that Old Kingdom Egyptians were simply Northwest Africans transplanted eastward. It means the strongest available proxy for much of his ancestry points to a deep North African-related layer. But about 1/5 of his ancestry was best modeled with a source related to the eastern Fertile Crescent, including Mesopotamia. Again, this does not mean he was 1/5 Mesopotamian in a modern national sense. It does not mean a Mesopotamian army built Egypt, or that Egypt was founded by immigrants from Iraq. Ancient DNA does not work that way. These are statistical relationships between ancient populations, not identity labels. But the signal is still important because it suggests that by the Old Kingdom, contact between the Nile Valley and the worlds to the east had become part of ancestry, not only art, trade, or technology. That is the cleanest version of the reveal. Ancient Egypt was not built by outsiders, but it was not sealed from outsiders either. The old arguments wanted a single source. The genome showed a meeting point. This is where the archaeology and the DNA begin to speak to each other. Archaeologists had long seen signs of contact between early Egypt and the Near East, imported goods, technologies, motifs, and ideas moving through networks that connected the Nile Valley with the Levant, the Red Sea, and farther east. For years, the difficult question was whether those connections represented only objects and ideas, or also people. The Nuwayrat genome does not prove a single dramatic migration. It does not tell us when every movement occurred, or through which route, or how many people were involved, but it does show that movement across these regions was not only cultural, at least some of it entered human ancestry. That is a stronger and more interesting story than the old foreign spark myth. In the myth, Egypt needed outsiders to become great. In the DNA, Egypt does not need to be rescued from itself. The Nile world remains foundational. The early Egyptian state is still rooted in northeastern Africa, but the foundation was never a locked room. It stood in a landscape where people, animals, crops, techniques, and symbols could cross ecological borders. Imagine the Nile Valley during this period, before the pyramids had become ruins, before Egypt had become an object of tourism, before later empires had renamed and reinterpreted it. The river rises and falls. Fields darken after the flood. Workers cut clay, carry vessels, grind grain, haul stone, drive cattle, and move by boat between settlements. Somewhere along that world, a man lives long enough for his bones to show the record of repetition. He may never see Mesopotamia. He may never know the routes by which distant ancestry entered his family line, but his genome carries a memory larger than his own life. The body is local, the ancestry is layered, the civilization is both. That is the part modern categories struggle to hold. We are used to asking whether a people came from here or there, whether a civilization belongs to one continent or another, whether a face confirms one side of an argument. But the Nile Valley sits exactly where those questions become weak. Egypt is African. That is not negotiable. Its geography, river system, environment, and civilizational development are rooted in northeastern Africa. But Egypt was also connected to Western Asia and the Mediterranean world from very early times. Those facts do not cancel each other. They are the point. Later evidence makes the story even less static. The Abusir el-Meleq samples show that by the late New Kingdom, Ptolemaic, and Roman periods, at least one Middle Egyptian population had strong connections with Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean groups, and modern Egyptians show additional sub-Saharan African-related ancestry compared with those ancient samples. The 2025 work, when comparing the Old Kingdom individual to later data, also points toward changes across time rather than one unbroken genetic profile from the Pyramid Age to the present. But the gaps remain enormous. We still do not have a dense genetic map of ancient Egypt across every period and region. Upper Egypt is not sufficiently represented. The Delta is not sufficiently represented. Ordinary cemeteries are not sufficiently represented. Nubian borderlands, desert oases, provincial communities, elites and laborers, early farmers and later city populations all need more data. A single Old Kingdom genome is a landmark, but it is still one man. One site in Middle Egypt is useful, but it is still one site. One genome does not define a civilization, but one genome can break an assumption. The assumption it breaks is not that ancient Egyptians were local. They were. It is not that Egypt had outside contact. It did. The assumption it breaks is that those two ideas must be enemies. For too long, arguments about Egypt have treated local continuity and external connection as if one must defeat the other. But the ancient world did not work that way. A civilization could grow from its own river valley and still be connected to distant regions. A person could belong to the Nile and still carry ancestry shaped by older movements beyond it. The same caution applies to appearance. The Nuwayrat study includes phenotype predictions, suggesting brown eyes, brown hair, and darker skin pigmentation probabilities for the individual, but the researchers are careful because phenotype prediction in ancient and underrepresented populations is limited. A genome is not a camera. A reconstruction is not a photograph. A face made from a skull and DNA is a scientific interpretation, not a resurrection. This matters because ancient Egypt has always been over-visualized. We know it through faces. The mask of Tutankhamun, the profile of Nefertiti, the painted bodies on tomb walls, the Fayum portraits from Roman Egypt, the colossal statues of kings whose features were political as much as personal. But royal and artistic faces are not population averages. Tomb paintings are not photographs. Roman period mummy portraits are not Old Kingdom peasants. Every image has a context, a class, a period, and a purpose. The Nuwayrat man is valuable precisely because he is not the usual image. He is not the face of a king. He does not arrive wrapped in the visual authority of empire. He is a body with a genome, a burial, a location, and a date. His importance is not that he replaces every Egyptian face we already know. It is that he adds a human, early biological witness to a story that has been argued mostly through art, text, and modern projection. The deeper reveal, then, is not that ancient Egyptians were secretly one thing or another. The reveal is that ancient Egypt was already layered near the beginning of the story we care about most. By the Old Kingdom, the Nile Valley was not a racial myth waiting to be claimed. It was a functioning civilization in a connected world, carrying deep North African roots and detectable links to the eastern Fertile Crescent, while later periods would add still more layers from the Levant, Nubia, the Mediterranean, and other African regions. The phrase ancient Egyptians makes them sound like one fixed group, but Egypt was not a single moment. It was 3,000 years of dynastic history before Rome, and much more if you include the prehistory that made it possible. A person living near the beginning of the Old Kingdom did not necessarily have the same ancestry profile as someone in the Delta under the Ramessides, or someone in Thebes during the Third Intermediate Period, or someone in Roman period Fayum. Time matters. Region matters, class matters, burial context matters, sampling matters. This is why the safest answer is also the most powerful one. The ancient Egyptians were not a modern race category. They were a historical population, or rather many related populations, living across a long river system at the crossroads of Africa and Western Asia. Their story cannot be reduced to purity, but it also should not be dissolved into vagueness. There was local foundation, there was continuity, there was contact, there was change. All of these are visible at once. That may sound less dramatic than saying DNA proved one side right, but it is actually more dramatic because it changes the question. The real question is not what modern group owns ancient Egypt. The real question is how a river valley in northeastern Africa became one of the most durable civilizations in history while standing open, in controlled and uneven ways, to the wider world around it. Ancient DNA is beginning to answer that, but it is not finished. The science is still young, the sample sizes are still small. Every new genome may shift the picture, especially when researchers finally recover more early data from Upper Egypt, the Delta, Nubian border zones, and ordinary cemeteries. What we have now is not the final portrait, it is the first crack in the wall. And through that crack, the old argument looks smaller. The modern world wanted ancient Egypt to be a verdict. The DNA is making it a history again. Return, finally, to the man in the ceramic vessel. He did not know he was early data. He did not know that thousands of years later, people would use his genome to argue about continents, identities, and ownership. He lived in a world of river mud, vessels, labor, food, family, burial, and belief. His ancestry stretched beyond him, as all ancestry does. His bones' ancestry endured because of conditions no one designed for science. His genome survived long enough to tell us that Egypt's beginning was not simple enough for our categories. That is the strange mercy of ancient DNA. It does not flatter the stories we bring to the dead. It does not care which modern argument wants to win. It only preserves traces of movement, kinship, continuity, and mixture, until someone finally learns how to read them. The ancient Egyptians were never who we thought they were, because we kept asking them to be one thing. They were not a sealed population untouched by the world. They were not a foreign civilization planted on African soil. They were not a modern identity waiting in ancient form. They were people of the Nile, rooted in northeastern Africa, connected to the Fertile Crescent, changed across time, and far too old to fit inside the categories that came after them. The truth is not that Egypt had no origin. The truth is that its origin was never small. The river carried water, grain, stone, labor, gods, and kings. It also carried memory. And now, from one body in a pot and a handful of mummies from a later cemetery, ancient DNA has begun to show that the memory was layered from the start. Not pure, not foreign, not simple. Egypt was itself. And that was always larger than the argument.